I learned early that our family measured stability the way other families measured happiness. Stability was the proof that everything was functioning as it should. It showed up in the way our homes were maintained, in the predictability of schedules, in the absence of visible conflict. Nothing was ever allowed to feel unresolved. Even uncertainty was managed. I was raised inside that expectation. From a young age, I understood that being composed was not simply polite, it was strategic. Feelings were acknowledged only once they had been filtered, shaped into something useful or at least unobtrusive. Questions were encouraged if they refined an existing plan. Questions that introduced alternatives were quietly redirected. Outwardly, my family was admired. We were described as generous, principled, deeply connected. People spoke about our unity with a kind of reverence. I absorbed those descriptions without questioning them, because they were repeated often enough to feel factual. It did not occur to me that cohesion could exist without closeness, or that loyalty might be enforced through design rather than choice. As a child, I learned to watch more than I spoke. I noticed how certain topics created subtle shifts in posture or tone. I learned which relatives carried authority without raising their voices, and which opinions were treated as ornamental rather than influential. No one explained this hierarchy directly. It was absorbed through repetition, through observation, through the quiet reward of approval. Education was handled with precision. I was sent to the right schools, introduced to the right people, placed in environments where discretion mattered as much as talent. I did well. Not because I was driven by ambition, but because competence was expected. Excellence was simply the baseline. What I did not yet understand was that my role was already being defined in ways that had little to do with my abilities. I was encouraged to be articulate, thoughtful, reliable. I was also subtly guided away from anything that suggested volatility. Risk, in our family, was not moral or immoral. It was operational. As I grew older, plans formed around me like architecture. Careers suggested, futures outlined. These were never presented as constraints. They were framed as opportunities, as thoughtful preparations made on my behalf. I accepted them without resistance, assuming that participation would naturally follow preparation. There was comfort in that assumption. It allowed me to believe that belonging was automatic, that proximity guaranteed relevance, that care and control were interchangeable. The first cracks were small enough to dismiss, a conversation I was not included in, a decision explained after the fact. Each instance was reasonable on its own. Circumstances, timing, efficiency. I trusted the system because it had always appeared benevolent. Yet over time, the omissions became patterned. I was no longer asked how I felt about certain directions. Instead, I was informed of them. Language shifted subtly. Discussions became updates. Participation was replaced by reassurance. No one told me I had been repositioned. There was no meeting, no acknowledgement. It happened the way systems often change, incrementally, politely, without resistance. My presence remained welcome. My influence did not. At first, I interpreted this as temporary, a phase, a recalibration that would resolve itself. Families, especially powerful ones, are always adjusting. I assumed my place would settle naturally. What I did not yet see was that the adjustment was not provisional. It was corrective. Somewhere, without my awareness, I had been categorized not as a contributor, but as a consideration. And once that designation was in place, everything else followed quietly, exactly as it was designed to. There was a peculiar relief in finally understanding that nothing I did would return me to the center. Once that expectation dissolved, so did a great deal of quiet tension I had been carrying without naming. I no longer measured my relevance by proximity to decision-making. I stopped interpreting silence as something I needed to fill. The absence of invitation became information, not rejection. I began to notice how consistently the family relied on the same mechanisms. Consensus was manufactured long before anyone spoke. The appearance of agreement mattered more than its substance. People who aligned were trusted. People who complicated alignment were managed. It was not personal. It was efficient. Looking back, I could see how early this framework had been introduced. Even childhood disagreements were resolved through redirection rather than engagement. One learned quickly that persistence was unnecessary. The system would move regardless, and resistance only marked one as disruptive. Compliance, on the other hand, was rewarded with ease. As an adult, I had been treated with courtesy and confidence, yet always within carefully maintained limits. My intelligence was acknowledged so long as it reinforced existing plans. My independence was celebrated when it reduced the need to consult me. Every trait I possessed was acceptable, provided it did not alter outcomes. Once I saw that clearly, I stopped taking it personally. My family did not lack affection, they lacked tolerance for unpredictability. In their world, control was synonymous with care. To release control felt negligent, and so they never truly did. The irony was that my gradual disengagement made me easier to admire. Distance softened my edges. Without the friction of involvement, I became an abstract success story, someone who had found her own way. They spoke of me with pride, as though my autonomy had been their intention all along. I did not correct this interpretation. It served me to let it stand. What changed internally was subtle but decisive. I stopped assuming that alignment was a virtue. I stopped equating harmony with honesty. I allowed myself to value clarity over cohesion, even when clarity was inconvenient. I also stopped waiting for acknowledgement. That had been the quietest trap of all, the belief that recognition would validate my position. Once I let that go, my choices became cleaner. I no longer needed to be seen to be certain of where I stood. Over time, the family's influence over my decisions diminished to the point of irrelevance. Not because I opposed them, but because I no longer oriented myself around their expectations. Their approval ceased to be a factor. Their disapproval equally so. This did not result in conflict. It resulted in parallel lives. We occupied the same gatherings, exchanged the same courtesies, shared history without sharing authority. The separation was invisible to outsiders and comfortable enough for everyone involved. Occasionally, someone would test the boundary, a suggestion framed as concern, a reminder of shared interests. I listened, considered, and responded on my own terms. The absence of deference was noted, even if it was never named. In the end, nothing dramatic occurred. There was no final confrontation, no declaration of independence, just a quiet, sustained choice to remain self-directed. They had treated me like a liability because liabilities must be controlled. I removed myself from the category entirely, and once I did, there was nothing left for them to manage. The longer this arrangement persisted, the more apparent it became that my family did not experience the separation as a loss. In their internal accounting, nothing essential had been removed. The structure remained intact. Roles were clearly filled. Continuity was preserved. From their perspective, success was measurable and ongoing. What changed was how they related to me. I was no longer positioned as someone whose alignment needed to be ensured. Instead, I was referenced as an example, quietly, selectively. Someone who had chosen a different rhythm. Someone who had always valued independence. These descriptions were not inaccurate, but they were incomplete. They allowed the family to explain my distance without examining its cause. I listened to these narratives develop without interruption. There was no benefit in correcting them. To do so would have required naming dynamics they had spent decades refining in order to avoid scrutiny. Families like mine do not survive by inviting examination. They survive by making their processes appear natural. I noticed, too, that the people who remained closest to the center carried a particular kind of fatigue. Not visible exhaustion, but a vigilance that never relaxed. They were always adjusting, anticipating, calibrating. Their authority depended on constant presence. My absence relieved me of that burden entirely. I began to understand that what I had stepped away from was not responsibility, but maintenance. The continuous effort required to remain indispensable, the careful monitoring of one's relevance, the subtle performance of agreement. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was consuming. In contrast, my life had become quieter in a different way. Decisions were made without rehearsal. Preferences did not need to be justified. I no longer felt the need to translate my thinking into language that would be received favorably. The simplicity was not accidental. It was the result of choosing environments where clarity was valued over consensus. From time to time, a family member would express mild curiosity about this. They would ask how I found working without the same level of support, or whether I ever missed the sense of belonging. The questions were sincere, but they assumed a deficit that did not exist. I answered honestly, though gently. I had learned that honesty need not be exhaustive to be true. What they could not quite reconcile was that my distance had not resulted in instability. There was no visible cost, no unraveling. I was not struggling, nor was I seeking reintegration. This contradicted an unspoken belief that autonomy carried risk, especially for someone raised within a protected system. Yet here I was, functioning without oversight. That reality unsettled them more than resistance ever would have. Resistance could be managed. It created something to respond to. My quiet self-direction offered no leverage. There was nothing to correct, nothing to negotiate. I was no longer positioned within their decision-making framework at all. Over time, the dynamic settled into something mutually convenient. They stopped anticipating my involvement. I stopped anticipating their approval. We met on neutral ground, exchanged updates rather than intentions. The emotional temperature remained stable. No one was deprived of dignity. Looking back, I see now that my family did exactly what they believed was necessary. They optimized for control, for predictability, for continuity. In doing so, they narrowed their field of vision. They could not see beyond the system they had perfected. I did not escape them by force or by confrontation. I simply stopped consenting to be optimized. That choice did not make me powerful in their terms. It made me something else entirely, unmanaged. And in a family where everything is managed, that is the most independent position one can occupy. Once I understood that unmanaged did not mean unseen, I stopped worrying about how my choices would be interpreted. My family had always excelled at interpretation. It was how they maintained coherence. Meaning was assigned efficiently, shaped to preserve the logic of the system. My role within that logic no longer required refinement. There were practical consequences, of course. Certain advantages receded quietly. Introductions were less frequent. Invitations to participate in ventures were framed as optional rather than assumed. Information arrived later, filtered through summaries instead of conversations. None of this felt punitive. It felt consistent. What surprised me was how little of it I missed. I had grown up believing that proximity to influence was a form of security, that being close to power protected you from volatility. Distance, I was taught, was where risk lived. Yet as my life continued without constant alignment checks or implicit negotiations, I felt a steadiness I had not known before, not the steadiness of containment, but of authorship. I began to notice how often my earlier decisions had been shaped by anticipation, not fear exactly, but consideration. Would this complicate matters? Would it require explanation? Would it be perceived as unnecessary divergence? Once those questions stopped governing my thinking, my choices became simpler, not easier, but cleaner. The family, meanwhile, continued as it always had. Systems refined themselves, roles calcified. New generations were guided along familiar paths, praised for fitting seamlessly into existing structures. I observed this from a respectful distance, without commentary. There was no satisfaction in critique. The machinery worked precisely because it resisted reflection. Occasionally, someone would attempt to reestablish a thread. a conversation framed as concern or nostalgia, a suggestion that collaboration might be beneficial. These overtures were never forceful. They did not need to be. They were invitations to return to legibility. I declined without refusing. That distinction mattered. I did not oppose their worldview. I simply did not reorganize myself to fit it. This left them without a clear response. There was nothing to defend against, nothing to persuade. I existed adjacent to their influence, but beyond its reach. Over time, I realized that what my family valued most was not loyalty, but predictability. Loyalty could be disruptive if it demanded accommodation. Predictability allowed planning. It allowed the future to be arranged in advance. My independence disrupted that only insofar as it could not be accounted for, and so it was excluded from calculation. That exclusion, once internalized, became liberating. I stopped feeling responsible for maintaining equilibrium. The emotional labor of smoothing transitions, of anticipating discomfort, of translating intention into acceptable form, none of it was required of me anymore. I could listen without absorbing. I could speak without calibrating. Silence became choice rather than compliance. The final shift was subtle. I noticed it during a conversation that, years earlier, would have unsettled me. A relative spoke about legacy, about continuity, about the importance of preserving what had been built. I listened, nodded, and felt no impulse to respond. Not because I disagreed, but because it no longer defined my horizon. Their legacy was intact. So was mine. I had not rejected my family. I had simply stopped allowing their systems to dictate the shape of my life. There was no rupture, because there was no longer a point of tension. Influence requires access. Control requires consent. I had withdrawn both quietly, without ceremony. In the end, I did not need to be understood. I needed only to be precise about my own position. They treated me like a liability because liabilities threaten stability. I became something stability could not contain, and that was not a failure of belonging. It was the beginning of sovereignty. With that sovereignty came a different kind of responsibility, one that did not involve stewardship of assets or preservation of reputation, but stewardship of attention. I became careful about where I invested my energy, not out of scarcity, but out of clarity. I understood now that attention was the resource my family guarded most fiercely. It was how influence was maintained, how alignment was enforced, how dissent was neutralized before it could take shape. Without realizing it, I had stepped outside that economy. I watched how family discussions continued to orbit familiar concerns, risk mitigation, legacy protection, strategic patience. These were not hollow priorities. They had built something substantial and enduring, but they also required a narrowing of perspective. Anything that could not be integrated cleanly was treated as noise. Complexity was tolerated only if it could be resolved into procedure. My life increasingly did not resolve that way. It unfolded according to contingencies they did not anticipate and could not optimize for. I did not offer updates unless asked. I did not frame my decisions in terms they would find persuasive. This was not defiance. It was coherence. I had stopped translating. There were moments when this divergence became visible, a choice I made that could not be easily categorized, an outcome that did not align with expected trajectories. These moments were met with polite curiosity, sometimes admiration, sometimes faint concern, but never with engagement. Engagement would have required investment, and investment required predictability. I began to see how much of the family's strength depended on that predictability. It allowed them to move quickly, decisively, without hesitation. It also limited their capacity to adapt to anything that did not resemble what they already knew. The system was elegant, but it was closed. I did not feel superior for recognizing this, only relieved. I no longer felt compelled to improve or correct it. Systems rarely respond well to unsolicited refinement. They protect their own logic. Instead, I focused on cultivating resilience outside their framework, relationships built on mutual recognition rather than shared history, work that responded to real conditions rather than inherited expectations, a sense of continuity that did not depend on endorsement. Over time, my family adjusted fully to my position. I was no longer discussed as a deviation. I had become part of the background narrative, present, stable, unremarkable in my independence. This was the highest form of acceptance they could offer. It required no maintenance. I understood then that my earlier fear, that distance would erode belonging, had been misplaced. Belonging had never been the currency at stake. Control was. Once I stopped contesting that, everything else recalibrated naturally. There was no resentment left in me, only understanding. My family had acted according to their values, just as I was now acting according to mine. The difference was that I no longer needed their values to validate my choices. The quiet betrayal I once sensed was not a single act or decision. It was a gradual prioritization of stability over reciprocity, of systems over individuals. Recognizing that did not diminish what we shared. It contextualized it. In the end, I did not reclaim a place within their structure. I built a life beside it, one that did not require negotiation to sustain itself. They continued to manage what they could measure. I continued to live beyond what could be contained. And that separation, once painful to name, became simply the way things were. Calm, deliberate, and finally, my own. As time passed, the separation I had once felt so acutely faded into something quieter and more durable. It no longer registered as distance. It was simply context. I did not think of myself as having stepped away. I thought of myself as having settled somewhere else. The distinction mattered. One implied loss. The other implied placement. I became increasingly aware of how rarely my family spoke about choice. Decisions were framed as outcomes of circumstance, necessity, or foresight. Very little was attributed to preference. This, I realized, was how responsibility was distributed without ever becoming personal. If no one chose, no one could be blamed. The system chose. The structure decided. Individuals merely executed. Outside of that logic, my own decisions felt exposed in a different way. They were clearly mine. If something worked, it was because I had chosen it. If it failed, the same applied. There was no abstraction to absorb the consequence. This might have frightened me once. Instead, it clarified my relationship to risk. Risk, when owned, lost much of its menace. Occasionally, I would hear echoes of concern, usually indirect. Someone would mention the volatility of the world, the value of insulation, the wisdom of consolidation. These comments were never directed at me explicitly. They floated into conversations like reminders, as if proximity alone might reassert relevance. I listened politely and let them pass. My life no longer required reinforcement. What I found most striking was how little curiosity there was about the substance of my independence. My family was comfortable acknowledging that I had chosen a different path, but uninterested in examining why that path functioned. Understanding it would have required questioning their own assumptions, and assumptions, when successful, become invisible. I did not press the issue. Curiosity, like authority, must be invited to endure. Instead, I cultivated a form of stability that did not depend on continuity. My routines were flexible. My commitments were explicit. My relationships did not require translation. I learned the difference between being supported and being buffered. One strengthens, the other contains. There were moments when I felt the contrast sharply. Family gatherings where conversations revolved around long-term safeguards, contingency planning, the careful elimination of exposure. I would listen, aware that my own sense of security was rooted elsewhere, not in insulation from uncertainty, but in familiarity with it. I did not romanticize this difference. It carried its own costs. Independence demands attentiveness. There is no system quietly correcting course on your behalf, but I found that attentiveness preferable to compliance. It kept me present in my own life. Over time, I realized that the label my family had applied to me, liability, had been less about danger and more about deviation. I did not fit cleanly into projections that relied on uniformity. I introduced angles that complicated forecasts. In a world organized around control, that alone was sufficient cause for management. By removing myself from that framework, I had not proven them wrong. I had simply made their categorization irrelevant. There was no final acknowledgement of this shift. No conversation where it was named and resolved. Resolution, in families like mine, does not come through articulation. It comes through normalization. And eventually, my autonomy became normal. I was no longer explained away. I was simply understood as separate. That understanding did not feel like exile. It felt like accuracy. In stepping outside the mechanisms that once defined me, I did not lose my family. I lost only the illusion that belonging required submission. What remained was quieter, less performative, and more honest than anything I had known before. I did not return to the center. I did not need to. I had learned how to stand without it. By then I had stopped thinking of the center as something fixed. It was not a place so much as a posture, a way of orienting oneself toward authority, toward consensus, toward the future as it had already been imagined. Once I recognized that, it became clear why I could not return. I no longer stood at the same angle. My family continued to gather, to plan, to reinforce what had already proven effective. Their conversations retained the same cadence, the same careful sequencing. I listened without impatience. There was comfort in their predictability even now. It reminded me where I came from, if not where I was going. What I noticed most, however, was how rarely anyone asked themselves what the structure demanded of them in return. Control was treated as neutral, almost benevolent. It kept things orderly. It prevented error. It ensured continuity. The cost of that control, narrowed possibility, deferred individuality, was accepted as necessary, even virtuous. I understood that logic intimately. I had lived within it long enough to respect its coherence. What I no longer accepted was its universality, the idea that there was only one way to remain intact. In quieter moments, I considered what might have happened had I complied more fully, had I asked fewer questions, had I aligned my curiosity with their priorities rather than my own. I could imagine the version of myself that would have emerged, competent, positioned, deeply embedded. That version would have been valued, trusted, central. She also would have been managed. That recognition did not come with regret. It came with relief. I had not lost a future. I had avoided one that would have required constant negotiation of my interior life. I would have been legible at the cost of being precise. As years passed, my family's references to me grew increasingly abstract. I became an anecdote, a point of contrast. Someone would mention my name in the context of resilience or self-sufficiency. It was always complimentary. It was also always distant. I existed as an outcome rather than a participant. That distance no longer unsettled me. I had learned to measure closeness differently. Proximity was not intimacy. Inclusion was not influence. And influence, I had discovered, was not the same as authorship. Authorship was quieter. It involved choosing without rehearsal, acting without signaling, accepting consequence without deflection. It required a tolerance for ambiguity that my family, for all their sophistication, had never cultivated. I did not judge them for this. Their system had been built to survive specific threats. It was optimized for a world where visibility invited vulnerability and consolidation offered protection. In many ways, it had worked remarkably well, but it was not the only way to live intact. I had found that clarity did not require dominance, that stability could emerge from responsiveness rather than control, that a life could be coherent without being tightly bounded. These realizations did not make me exceptional, they made me congruent. The final shift came so gradually that I barely noticed it. I stopped framing my family's behavior as betrayal. That word implied intent, rupture, moral failure. None of those quite fit. What had happened was quieter and more procedural. A series of choices, each defensible on its own, that ultimately deprioritized reciprocity in favor of manageability. Understanding that allowed me to release the last residue of resentment. I no longer needed to be vindicated. I needed only to remain accurate. Now, when I attend family gatherings, I do so without expectation. I am neither waiting to be consulted nor bracing to be excluded. I occupy my place without effort. I listen. I contribute when it feels natural. I leave when it does not. They accept this arrangement because it does not threaten the structure, and I accept it because it does not threaten me. In the end, I did not dismantle the system that sidelined me. I stepped far enough away that it no longer shaped my movement. That was the most effective response available to me. Not resistance, not reconciliation, but reorientation. They built a world where everything could be managed. I chose to live where something could still move. And in that space, quiet and unremarkable, I finally understood what control had cost me and what letting it go had returned. There are days now when I think about how easily this outcome might be misunderstood if it were described from the outside. It would sound like detachment, perhaps even estrangement, a story about someone who drifted away from a powerful family and learned to stand alone. That narrative would be tidy. It would also be wrong. Nothing drifted, nothing broke. What changed was orientation. I still know how the family operates. I could step back into their logic without effort if I chose to. The language, the pacing, the assumptions, they are embedded deeply enough to remain fluent. That fluency is not a temptation. It is simply part of my history. Like a first language you no longer speak daily but never forget. Sometimes I am asked, usually by people who know us only peripherally, whether it is difficult to remain separate. The question carries an assumption that separation requires effort. I answer honestly, it does not. What required effort was remaining inside while pretending the limits were not there. Inside the system, every choice had a shadow. Each preference needed a justification that aligned with continuity. Even silence was interpreted. Even restraint was cataloged. There was no neutral position. You were either reinforcing the structure or introducing friction. I did not want to spend my life deciding which version of myself was least disruptive. Outside it, neutrality returned. This did not mean that life became simple or unchallenging. It meant that challenges arrived without choreography. Problems appeared as themselves, not as threats to balance or reputation. I could respond directly without calculating how my response would be absorbed by others. That immediacy felt unfamiliar at first, then indispensable. I'm aware that my family still believes they protected me, that they spared me a complexity I did not need to carry. In a way, they are right, but not in the way they imagine. What they removed me from was not difficulty. It was authorship. And authorship, once experienced, is difficult to relinquish. There is a quiet confidence that comes from knowing that your life is not being interpreted in rooms you will never enter, that no one is smoothing your edges in advance of future conversations, that your decisions may be surprising, even inconvenient, without being disallowed. I do not confuse this with freedom in the abstract. Freedom is too large a word. What I gained was alignment between thought and action, intention and outcome. I no longer live in anticipation of correction. When I look at my family now, I do so without bitterness. I see people who have invested deeply in a system that rewards consistency and foresight. I respect what it has given them. I also see the cost, the narrowing, the vigilance, the quiet exhaustion of maintaining indispensability. They do not see that cost as loss. It has been normalized. It has been reframed as responsibility, as stewardship, as care. To question it would feel irresponsible, even disloyal. I understand why they do not. What I have learned is that loyalty does not require surrender. Belonging does not require submission. And love, when it is filtered through control, is still love. But it is not the only kind available. My life is not a rebuttal to theirs. It is not an alternative model offered for comparison. It simply exists alongside it, complete on its own terms. That coexistence is possible because I no longer ask the family to see me clearly. I see myself clearly. That is sufficient. If there is authority in this position, it is not the authority to command or influence. It is the authority to decide without permission, to move without explanation, to remain legible only to oneself. They treated me like a liability because liabilities must be contained, mitigated, planned around. I became someone who did not require planning, not because I was reckless, but because I was finally allowed to be exact. In quiet moments, I sometimes consider how unusual it is to arrive at certainty without spectacle. Most narratives suggest that clarity follows confrontation, that independence is forged through rupture. My experience did not conform to that shape. There was no defining argument, no decisive break. What carried me forward was accumulation of small recognitions, of repeated confirmations that my instincts were sound. I learned to trust the absence of urgency. When nothing presses you to decide quickly, you begin to notice what endures. My family's world thrived on timing, on being early, on anticipating shifts before others could respond. Outside that framework, time felt less strategic. It became something to inhabit rather than manage. I also learned how rarely people question structures that work for them. Success validates its own methods. When outcomes are favorable, process becomes invisible. My family had achieved enough to believe that their way was not merely effective, but correct. To suggest otherwise would have felt destabilizing, even dangerous. I did not challenge that belief. I simply stopped organizing my life around it. As years passed, my presence within the family settled into a rhythm that required no adjustment. I was invited to celebrations, acknowledged in conversations, consulted occasionally on matters deemed appropriate. The boundaries were understood on both sides. There was no hostility in them, only definition. What surprised me was how often people mistook this arrangement for compromise. They assumed I had accepted limits in exchange for peace. The truth was simpler. I had accepted accuracy. I no longer pretended that proximity equaled influence or that inclusion guaranteed agency. Once those illusions fell away, there was nothing left to negotiate. I noticed, too, how my family's language softened around me. Where once there had been subtle correction, there was now careful neutrality. I was no longer guided. I was observed. That shift carried its own respect, even if it was never named. In private, I reflected on the version of myself that once waited, patiently, hopefully, for a signal that participation would be restored. I felt no disdain for her. She'd been operating with the information available at the time. She had believed in a system that rewarded compliance with belonging. Letting go of that belief was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of discernment. There is a particular peace that comes from knowing that you are no longer being evaluated, not because you have exceeded expectations, but because you have stepped outside the criteria entirely. Evaluation requires investment. Once that investment is withdrawn, judgment loses its function. My family did not stop caring about me. They stopped calibrating me. That distinction mattered more than I had anticipated. It allowed me to remain connected without being constrained, to share space without sharing control. Looking back, I see that what they labeled liability was simply difference that could not be streamlined. I did not threaten their stability through opposition. I threatened it by refusing to be predictable. In systems built on foresight, unpredictability is the only real disruption. By choosing a life that could not be optimized from the outside, I had quietly removed myself from their strategic horizon. I was no longer a variable to be managed. I was background, visible, intact, and ungoverned. This did not elevate me above them. It placed me beside myself. That, in the end, was the only position I had ever wanted. And having found it, I no longer felt the need to justify how I arrived there. By the time this understanding fully settled, it had reshaped how I thought about continuity itself. I had once believed continuity was something inherited, something maintained through careful preservation of what already existed. In my family, continuity was almost sacred. It justified decisions, explained exclusions, softened sacrifices. It was the reason given when no other reason could be offered. Outside that framework, continuity revealed a different character. It was not something handed down intact. It was something generated through coherence over time, through repeated alignment between what one believed and what one did. It did not require insulation from uncertainty. It required responsiveness to it. This realization altered how I related not only to my family, but to memory. I stopped revisiting moments in search of proof that things might have gone differently. The question of whether I could have remained central lost its relevance. Centrality was never the issue. Congruence was. I understood then that the quiet betrayal I had once sensed was not directed at me as a person. It was directed at anything that resisted smooth integration. The family did not single me out maliciously. They simply optimized around me. In doing so, they preserved the structure at the cost of relationship depth. That trade-off was invisible to them because it had always been in place. Recognizing this allowed me to reframe my past without bitterness. I could acknowledge the care that existed alongside the control, the generosity that coexisted with management, the affection that operated within limits. None of it was false. It was simply conditional in ways I had not fully understood until later. What surprised me most was how little explanation this required once I stopped demanding it. I did not need my family to admit anything. I did not need language to validate my experience. The clarity existed independently of recognition. That independence was what gave it weight. As I moved further into my own life, I became attentive to how easily systems replicate themselves, how quickly people adopt rules that promise safety, even when those rules constrain growth. I saw echoes of my family's logic in institutions, organizations, even friendships that valued harmony over honesty. Having lived inside such a system, I could recognize its contours immediately. I did not reject these environments outright. I simply remained aware of the cost of participation. Awareness, I found, was enough to preserve choice. When I returned home now, the houses felt smaller, not diminished, but complete. Their purpose was clear. They were built to impress, to endure, to contain. I could admire them without mistaking them for freedom. I could walk their corridors without feeling shaped by them. My family continued to function as they always had. New plans replaced old ones. Roles were reinforced. The future remained carefully outlined. They were good at what they did. They remained respected, influential, intact. I remained myself. There was no dramatic moment when this divergence was acknowledged, no closing conversation, no reconciliation scene. That kind of symmetry belongs to stories that require resolution. My life did not. It required only accuracy. In time, even the word liability lost its charge. It became an artifact of an earlier frame, a designation that only made sense within a system I no longer inhabited. Outside it, the concept dissolved. What remained was something quieter and more durable than vindication, a sense of internal permission, the knowledge that my life did not need to be legible to others in order to be valid, that my choices did not require consensus to be sound. If there is wisdom in this story, it is not about leaving or staying, resisting or complying. It is about recognizing when a system no longer reflects who you are and adjusting your position accordingly, Not loudly, not defiantly, just precisely. They treated me like a liability because I did not fit cleanly into what they had built. I did not try to change what they built. I built something else. And in doing so, I learned that sovereignty is rarely claimed. It is assumed, quietly, once you stop asking to be placed. There are moments now when I catch myself speaking about my family with a kind of neutrality that would have once felt impossible. Not distance exactly, and certainly not coldness. More like accuracy stripped of urgency. I no longer feel compelled to defend them, nor to indict them. They are simply what they are, and I am no longer organized around the need to make sense of that in real time. This shift has altered how I relate to other forms of authority as well. I am slower to accept structures at face value, slower to internalize expectations that arrive without explanation. When something asks for my compliance, I look first at what it offers in return and what it quietly assumes I will give up. That reflex was sharpened inside my family long before I named it. I notice now how often people confuse stability with safety. Stability can be manufactured, it can be imposed, it can be preserved through exclusion as easily as through care. Safety, on the other hand, requires responsiveness. It requires the ability to adjust when reality changes. My family excelled at the former. I have learned to value the latter. What I carry from them is not resentment, but fluency. I understand how systems maintain themselves, how narratives are curated, how silence can function as agreement. This understanding has served me well outside their world. It allows me to engage without being absorbed, to participate without surrendering authorship. There is a temptation, when reflecting on stories like mine, to look for villains or heroes. That temptation fades when you spend enough time inside functional power. Power rarely announces itself as cruelty. It presents as necessity, as foresight, as protection. Those who wield it often believe sincerely in their own restraint. My family believed they were doing what was required. I believe that too. Where we diverged was in what we were willing to require of ourselves. They required conformity in exchange for continuity. I required coherence in exchange for peace. Neither position is inherently moral. They are simply incompatible. What I have learned is that incompatibility does not demand resolution. It demands placement. Once each element occupies the position that suits it, friction diminishes. That was the quiet work of the years that followed my withdrawal from the center. Not healing in the dramatic sense, but settling. I did not need closure because nothing was left open. The questions that once kept me alert. Why am I not included? What am I missing? When will this change? Fell away when I stopped assuming that inclusion was the metric by which my life should be measured. The metric changed. Everything else followed. My family still exists as a reference point, but no longer as a compass. Their values inform my understanding, not my direction. I can appreciate their discipline without aspiring to replicate it. I can acknowledge their achievements without confusing them for my own. When people ask me now what it was like to grow up where I did, I answer carefully. I speak about opportunity, about education, about exposure. I do not speak about management unless I am asked directly, and even then, I choose my words with precision, not to protect them, but to remain truthful without dramatization. Truth does not always need volume to be heard. In the end, my story is not about being pushed aside nor about walking away. It is about recognizing the moment when a system stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a variable, and deciding quietly that you will no longer participate under those terms. They treated me like a liability because that was the only category that fit within their logic. I treated myself like an author. That choice did not require permission. It required only that I stop waiting to be accounted for. And once I did, my life continued, unmanaged, coherent, and entirely my own. In the years that followed, I became less interested in explaining my choices and more attentive to living them well. Explanation, I learned, often functions as a request for validation. Once you stop needing validation, explanation becomes optional. I answered questions when they were sincere. I declined them when they were not. The difference was easy to feel, even when it was never acknowledged aloud. What surprised me was how quickly life fills the space once you stop holding it open for someone else's interpretation. Projects took shape without preface. Relationships formed without negotiation. I no longer felt the impulse to position myself correctly before acting, or to anticipate how a decision might be received before I allowed myself to make it. Action itself became the position. This did not mean I rejected structure altogether. I still value order, clarity, and intention. Those instincts were shaped early and they remain part of me. What changed was my relationship to authority. I no longer assumed it resided outside myself. I no longer deferred to it reflexively. Authority, I discovered, is most stable when it is internal and quietly enforced, rather than borrowed from proximity or permission. My family, from time to time, attempted to re-establish a kind of relevance, not overtly, but through implication. A suggestion that something might be easier if done their way, a reminder of resources that were still technically available. These gestures were never coercive. They did not need to be. They relied on memory, on habit, on the residual pull of familiarity. I acknowledged them without engaging. Gratitude without compliance became my default response. It was not strategic. It was simply accurate. I could appreciate what had once been offered without reorganizing my life around it. Over time, those gestures diminished, not because I resisted them, but because they no longer produced movement. Influence requires effect. When effect disappears, influence follows. There was no conflict in this, only recalibration. I noticed then how rarely people talk about the cost of being indispensable. Indispensability sounds flattering, even noble, but it is a form of captivity. To be indispensable is to be permanently anticipated, permanently required to remain legible, permanently bound to a role that others depend on. I had been spared that fate, unintentionally, by being categorized as expendable. What once felt like marginalization revealed itself as freedom. I do not pretend this path is superior, it is simply mine. There are people who thrive within systems like my family's, who find satisfaction in continuity, who value predictability above all else. Their lives are coherent and often deeply effective. Mine operates on a different axis. It prioritizes alignment over leverage, authorship over reach. When I think now about legacy, the word carries less weight. I am less concerned with what will persist beyond me and more attentive to what is honest while I am here. Legacy, I have learned, often belongs to those who remain within the structure long enough to be remembered by it. I chose presence over permanence. If there is a quiet confidence in that choice, it comes not from certainty, but from sufficiency. My life does not feel provisional. It does not feel like a preface to something else. It feels complete in its movement, even as it remains open. My family continues to build, to consolidate, to refine. They remain what they have always been, respected, influential, admired. I wish them well without envy. Their world and mine touch lightly now, without friction or expectation. We share history, not governance. And that distinction, once painful to articulate, has become the most stable truth I know. I was never meant to be managed well. I was meant to be exact. And once I allowed that, everything else, control, belonging, distance, clarity, fell into place without needing to be named. There is a certain stillness that arrives when you stop narrating your life as a response to something else. I did not notice it at first. It was not dramatic. It felt like a reduction in background noise, the absence of a frequency I had grown accustomed to tuning out. Only later did I recognize it as relief. I no longer track my decisions against an invisible ledger. I do not wonder how they will be interpreted, or whether they will be seen as prudent, excessive, or unnecessary. That calculus belonged to a different life, one shaped by the constant awareness of being assessed, adjusted, prepared for use. Outside that framework, intention is allowed to stand on its own. What remains of my family and my daily life is not influence, but imprint. I still recognize the architecture of careful thinking. I still pause before acting, still value foresight, still notice the long view. Those habits were formed early, and they are not a burden. They are tools. The difference is that I now decide when to use them. Occasionally, I am reminded of how foreign this way of living would appear from the inside. A life not oriented around consolidation can look scattered. A path without visible optimization can appear inefficient. I understand that perspective well enough not to resent it. I once shared it, but I also know how narrow it is. Efficiency answers the question of how to preserve what already exists. It does not answer the question of who you become in the process. My family never asked that question aloud. It did not serve their objectives. I ask it often now, not out of doubt, but out of attentiveness. I have learned that clarity does not announce itself. It accumulates. It reveals itself through repetition, through the ease with which you wake, the steadiness with which you choose, the absence of urgency where urgency once lived. These are quiet indicators, easy to miss if you are looking for resolution instead of alignment. When I think of the word betrayal now, it no longer points outward. It does not describe what my family did or failed to do. It describes something more intimate. The moment you continue to participate in a structure that no longer reflects you, simply because it is familiar, that is the only betrayal that leaves a lasting mark. I stopped committing it against myself. That choice did not require confrontation. It required recognition. And recognition, once it arrives, cannot be undone. You may ignore it for a time, but it waits. Patient. Exact. It changes the shape of everything that follows. I did not lose my family when I stepped out of their system. I lost only the version of myself that required their approval to feel legitimate. What remained was quieter, less adorned, and far more durable. There are no final words that resolve a story like this. Resolution implies an ending, and nothing here has ended. My family continues. I continue. Our lives run alongside one another, intersecting occasionally without friction or expectation. That is enough. I was never meant to be folded neatly into what they built. I was meant to move freely beside it, informed but uncontained. Once I understood that, the rest was simply practice, and practice, over time, becomes life. What has stayed with me most as the years have settled into something recognizably my own is how little effort it now takes to remain steady. Stability, I once believed, required vigilance. It demanded constant adjustment, anticipation, readiness. What I have learned instead is that stability emerges naturally when you are no longer divided against yourself. Inside my family, steadiness was achieved through coordination. Everyone learned how to hold their place, how to defer at the right moments, how to present agreement even when questions lingered. That discipline produced remarkable consistency. It also required a quiet suppression of anything that could not be harmonized quickly. Outside that system, steadiness arrived differently. It came from allowing decisions to unfold at their own pace, from accepting uncertainty without rushing to resolve it, from letting consequences teach rather than threaten. This kind of steadiness is less impressive on the surface, but far more durable. It does not depend on others holding their positions. I still attend family gatherings from time to time. The conversations are familiar, the rhythms unchanged. I am greeted warmly, spoken to with respect. No one questions my place because my place is no longer contested. It is understood. I belong without being embedded. I am present without being central. Sometimes I sense a faint curiosity beneath the politeness. Not about what I am doing exactly, but about how I remain so unaffected by the absence of involvement. I suspect they expect distance to produce instability, or regret, or at least longing. When it does not, the absence becomes difficult to categorize. I do not explain it. Explanation would suggest that something needs to be reconciled. Nothing does. The truth is simpler. I am no longer oriented toward what I am not included in. My attention rests with what I am building, maintaining, choosing. Attention, I have learned, is the truest measure of agency. Where it rests, power follows. There was a time when I believed that being seen was essential, that visibility conferred legitimacy. Growing up as I did, this belief was reinforced constantly. What is seen can be protected. What is known can be planned for. What is accounted for can be preserved. What I know now is that invisibility, when chosen, is not erasure. It is relief. It allows movement without scrutiny. It allows growth without commentary. It creates space for becoming without interruption. My family never intended to give me that space. They did not imagine that stepping me aside would grant me something they themselves lacked. They believed they were reducing risk, narrowing variables, protecting continuity. They did not consider what becomes possible when continuity is no longer the primary objective. I have become attentive to that possibility in others as well. I notice when people remain inside systems that no longer reflect them because leaving feels disloyal or impractical or dangerous. I recognize the hesitation. I lived there for years. What I wish I could tell them, what I now understand, is that accuracy is not betrayal. It is alignment. When you align your life with who you actually are, rather than who a system requires you to be, a great deal of tension dissolves on its own. You stop needing permission. You stop seeking leverage. You stop mistaking endurance for fulfillment. Nothing about this makes me exceptional. It makes me congruent. If there is any quiet authority in that congruence, it is not something I wield. It is something I inhabit. It does not announce itself. It does not require defense. It simply remains. My family continues to manage what they value most. I continue to live in a way that does not require management. These two truths coexist without conflict. And in that coexistence, I have found a kind of peace that no system could have provided, no matter how carefully it was designed. As I look back now, what feels most significant is not the separation itself, but how unremarkable it has become. Distance, when sustained without drama, loses its edge. It stops being something you explain and starts being something you live inside. That quiet normalization did more to solidify my independence than any decisive act ever could have. I no longer carry a sense of having been displaced. That language belonged to an earlier stage, when I was still measuring myself against a center I assumed was fixed. Once I understood that the center was constructed and maintained at a cost, I stopped treating my position relative to it as a verdict. It was simply a difference in orientation. There are moments when I see my younger self clearly, the version of me who believed that patience would eventually be rewarded with inclusion, that if I remained composed, capable, unobtrusive, the system would recognize my value and adjust. I do not judge her for that belief. It was reasonable, given what she had been taught, but it was also incomplete. Systems do not reward patience. They reward usefulness. That realization, once it settled, changed how I understood my family's choices. They were not withholding something I had earned. They were organizing around what served them best. My presence, my perspective, my unpredictability did not serve the machinery as it was designed. That was not a moral failure on either side. It was a structural mismatch. Understanding this freed me from the need to be reassessed. I stopped waiting for circumstances to change in my favor. I stopped imagining alternate versions of the past where different timing or different words might have produced a different outcome. The outcome was not accidental. It was consistent. What surprised me was how quickly my nervous system adapted once I stopped anticipating correction. There's a subtle tension that comes from existing inside a structure that is always adjusting you. You may not notice it day to day, but its absence is unmistakable. Decisions land more cleanly, rest feels deeper, silence no longer feels provisional. I became more discerning about where I allowed myself to be shaped. Not every environment deserves your flexibility. Not every relationship merits your adaptation. This is something my family never articulated, though they practiced it relentlessly with the outside world. Internally, adaptation was assumed. I reverse that assumption. Now, when I enter any system, professional, social, institutional, I pay close attention to what it asks of me before it offers anything in return. I notice whether clarity is welcomed or smoothed over, whether dissent is integrated or neutralized. These signals are subtle, but they are consistent. Once you learn to read them, it becomes difficult to ignore what they imply. My family taught me that skill without intending to. It may be the most valuable inheritance they gave me. We still interact. There is civility, warmth, shared memory. I am not estranged. I am simply not enmeshed. The difference is profound. It allows affection without obligation, presence without performance. It allows me to care without ceding authorship of my life. If there is any sadness left in this story, it is not about what I lost. It is about how rarely people are given permission to recognize when a system no longer fits them. How often they mistake endurance for loyalty or silence for peace. I was fortunate enough to see the distinction before it calcified into regret. I did not dismantle anything. I did not expose or accuse. I did not demand to be understood. I adjusted my position until the tension disappeared. That was the most honest response available to me. My family continues to do what they have always done, manage complexity by narrowing it. I continue to do what I have learned suits me better. Live with complexity without trying to contain it. These paths do not compete. They simply diverge. And divergence, I have learned, does not have to be loud to be final. There is a quiet discipline required to remain where you are once you have chosen accuracy over approval. It is tempting, at times, to soften that stance, to explain yourself more fully, to make your decisions more legible, to reassure others that nothing essential has been lost. I learned, slowly, that this impulse is simply another form of accommodation. It recreates the very dynamic you have stepped away from. So I resisted it, not with stubbornness, but with consistency. I let my actions speak without commentary. I allowed outcomes to stand without interpretation. Over time, this created a different kind of trust. Not the trust that comes from predictability, but the trust that comes from reliability. People knew what to expect from me, not because I followed a script, but because I followed myself. My family noticed this, even if they never articulated it. Their engagement with me became lighter, less directive. They no longer offered guidance framed as concern. They no longer anticipated my alignment. In its place was a kind of respectful distance. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. Recognition without incorporation. This, I realized, was the only form of respect available within a system that cannot absorb difference without neutralizing it. To remain intact, the system must protect its edges. I had become one of those edges, acknowledged but not integrated. I did not resent this. I found it oddly fitting. There is a misconception that belonging must be total to be meaningful, that partial presence is a failure of commitment. I no longer believe this. Partial presence, when chosen, can be the most honest form of participation. It allows you to engage without disappearing, to remain in relationship without surrendering authorship. I have carried that understanding into every other area of my life. I no longer seek environments that promise inclusion at the cost of precision. I am wary of groups that prize harmony without room for dissent. I listen carefully to how disagreement is handled, how difference is framed. These details reveal more than any stated value ever could. What my family taught me, unintentionally, is that systems do not change because they are challenged. They change because they are bypassed. Influence shifts when attention shifts. Control weakens when consent is withdrawn, quietly and completely. I did not announce my withdrawal. I enacted it. That distinction matters. It preserved dignity on both sides. It allowed the relationship to remain civil, even affectionate, without requiring resolution. No one was forced to confront a narrative they were not prepared to revise, and I was no longer required to live inside one that diminished me. When I think now about the word power, it no longer conjures images of control or reach. Power, as I understand it, is the capacity to remain aligned with yourself across time, to make decisions that you do not need to defend later, to inhabit your life without constant recalibration. This is not a dramatic form of power. It does not impress. It does not consolidate. It does not endure beyond the individual who holds it. But it is sufficient. My family continues to value scale, continuity, influence. These things have served them well. I value coherence. It serves me. We speak occasionally about the future, about change, about the world as it shifts around us. There is no tension in these conversations now, only difference acknowledged without urgency. That is the final shape of this story. Not estrangement, not reconciliation, but parallel clarity. They treated me like a liability because they needed the world to remain predictable. I learned to live where predictability was optional, and in that space, quiet, unremarked, self-governed, I found a life that did not require management to remain whole. By the time I reached this point, I no longer thought of what had happened as something that required interpretation. Interpretation belongs to uncertainty. What I felt now was settled, not resolved, not closed. Settled, in the way a landscape becomes familiar once you stop expecting it to change shape. I noticed how rarely I revisited old conversations in my mind. The pauses, the omissions, the careful redirections that once occupied so much of my attention had lost their pull. They no longer needed to be decoded. I understood them well enough to let them rest. Memory, when it is no longer interrogated, becomes history. What replaced that vigilance was a quieter awareness of rhythm. My days moved according to priorities I had chosen deliberately. Work expanded and contracted without apology. Relationships deepened because they were not filtered through obligation. I had space to be unremarkable, which I had come to understand as a privilege rather than a diminishment. There were moments when I sensed how unfamiliar this ease would have seemed to my family. Ease, to them, was always provisional, something earned through preparation, safeguarded through oversight. My ease came from alignment. It did not require justification or reinforcement. It existed because nothing in me was being overridden. I also began to recognize how often people mistake restraint for passivity. My family had done this early on. My quiet had been interpreted as agreement, my composure as consent. Outside that context, I learned to use restraint differently, as choice, not default, as precision, not erasure. This distinction mattered. It meant I could speak when it was necessary and remain silent when it was not, without either position being assumed. I was no longer readable in the way systems prefer. That opacity was not defensive. It was simply the result of no longer optimizing myself for external use. When my family spoke of responsibility now, I heard it without resistance. Responsibility, in their language, meant stewardship of outcomes larger than any individual. I respected that aim. I simply no longer confused it with intimacy or care. Care, I had learned, could exist without governance. Intimacy could survive without oversight. We shared moments still, birthdays, holidays, brief intersections where familiarity softened the edges of difference. These moments were not hollow. They were simply bounded. I did not expect them to expand into something they were not designed to hold, and that was enough. I had stopped asking my family to be something they could not be without dismantling their own logic. In return, I stopped shrinking myself to remain legible within it. The exchange was fair, even if it was never articulated. If there is a final understanding I carry from all of this, it is that systems rarely betray people out of malice. They do so out of allegiance to continuity, to predictability, to their own preservation. When you no longer serve that allegiance, the system does not turn against you. It simply adjusts around you. I adjusted too, not by resisting, but by relocating my sense of authority, by choosing to live where my decisions did not need to be absorbed, justified, or smoothed over, by allowing myself to be exact, even when exactness made me inconvenient. The result was not freedom in the abstract, but something quieter and more sustaining, a life that moved at its own pace, a self that did not require translation, a belonging that began and ended with integrity. They treated me like a liability because liabilities complicate projections. I chose to live beyond projection, and once I did, the future no longer felt like something to be managed. It felt like something I could meet as I was, without apology or preparation. There is a humility that comes with accepting that some environments are not meant to change, and that you are not meant to change them. I once believed that understanding a system deeply carried with it an obligation to improve it. I no longer hold that belief. Insight does not always demand intervention. Sometimes it asks only for accurate distance. My family's world remains intact because it resists reinterpretation. It absorbs critique by reframing it as inefficiency. It neutralizes deviation by converting it into narrative. Over time, I learned that clarity, when offered to such a system, is rarely received as a gift. It is received as disruption. So I stopped offering it. This did not diminish my respect for what they had built. It refined it. I could admire the architecture without mistaking it for shelter. I could acknowledge the discipline without submitting to it. Appreciation no longer required participation. I began to notice how often people confuse loyalty with endurance. They remain in places that exhaust them because leaving would require acknowledging misalignment. My family never spoke about misalignment. They spoke about optimization, succession, continuity. Those words allowed them to remain committed without ever having to ask whether commitment was still appropriate. I asked that question privately, and once was enough. What followed was not isolation, but selectivity. I became deliberate about where I invested my presence. I noticed which conversations expanded me and which reduced me to a function, which relationships allowed reciprocity and which required performance. Over time, the distinction became intuitive. What replaced that vigilance was a quieter awareness of rhythm. My days moved according to priorities I had chosen deliberately. Work expanded and contracted without apology. Relationships deepened because they were not filtered through obligation. I had space to be unremarkable, which I had come to understand as a privilege rather than a diminishment. There were moments when I sensed how unfamiliar this ease would have seemed to my family. Ease, to them, was always provisional, something earned through preparation, safeguarded through oversight. My ease came from alignment. It did not require justification or reinforcement. It existed because nothing in me was being overridden. I also began to recognize how often people mistake restraint for passivity. My family had done this early on. My quiet had been interpreted as agreement, my composure as consent. Outside that context, I learned to use restraint differently, as choice, not default, as precision, not erasure. This distinction mattered. It meant I could speak when it was necessary and remain silent when it was not, without either position being assumed. I was no longer readable in the way systems prefer. That opacity was not defensive. It was simply the result of no longer optimizing myself for external use. When my family spoke of responsibility now, I heard it without resistance. Responsibility, in their language, meant stewardship of outcomes larger than any individual. I respected that aim. I simply no longer confused it with intimacy or care. Care, I had learned, could exist without governance. Intimacy could survive without oversight. We shared moments still, birthdays, holidays, brief intersections where familiarity softened the edges of difference. These moments were not hollow. They were simply bounded. I did not expect them to expand into something they were not designed to hold, and that was enough. I had stopped asking my family to be something they could not be without dismantling their own logic. In return, I stopped shrinking myself to remain legible within it. The exchange was fair, even if it was never articulated. If there is a final understanding I carry from all of this, it is that systems rarely betray people out of malice. They do so out of allegiance to continuity, to predictability, to their own preservation. When you no longer serve that allegiance, the system does not turn against you. It simply adjusts around you. I adjusted too, not by resisting, but by relocating my sense of authority, by choosing to live where my decisions did not need to be absorbed, justified, or smoothed over, by allowing myself to be exact, even when exactness made me inconvenient. The result was not freedom in the abstract, but something quieter and more sustaining, a life that moved at its own pace, a self that did not require translation, a belonging that began and ended with integrity. They treated me like a liability because liabilities complicate projections. I chose to live beyond projection, and once I did, the future no longer felt like something to be managed. It felt like something I could meet as I was, without apology or preparation. There is a humility that comes with accepting that some environments are not meant to change, and that you are not meant to change them. I once believed that understanding a system deeply carried with it an obligation to improve it. I no longer hold that belief. Insight does not always demand intervention. Sometimes it asks only for accurate distance. My family's world remains intact because it resists reinterpretation. It absorbs critique by reframing it as inefficiency. It neutralizes deviation by converting it into narrative. Over time, I learned that clarity, when offered to such a system, is rarely received as a gift. It is received as disruption. So I stopped offering it. This did not diminish my respect for what they had built. It refined it. I could admire the architecture without mistaking it for shelter. I could acknowledge the discipline without submitting to it. Appreciation no longer required participation. I began to notice how often people confuse loyalty with endurance. They remain in places that exhaust them because leaving would require acknowledging misalignment. My family never spoke about misalignment. They spoke about optimization, succession, continuity. Those words allowed them to remain committed without ever having to ask whether commitment was still appropriate. I asked that question privately, and once was enough. What followed was not isolation, but selectivity. I became deliberate about where I invested my presence. I noticed which conversations expanded me and which reduced me to a function, which relationships allowed reciprocity and which required performance. Over time, the distinction became intuitive. This selectivity was not defensive. It was preservative. It protected something that had taken years to recover, a sense of internal pacing. I no longer rushed to respond. I allowed silence to do its work. I trusted that what was meant to endure would not require urgency. When I am asked now whether I miss the sense of belonging that came with being embedded in a powerful family, I pause before answering. Belonging is not a singular experience. What I miss, occasionally, is familiarity, the shorthand of shared reference, the ease of assumed context. What I do not miss is the cost at which that ease was maintained. My life now contains a different kind of belonging, one that is earned through presence rather than position, one that adapts rather than consolidates. It is quieter, less visible, and far less impressive. It is also more responsive to who I actually am. There is no resentment left in me for what was withheld. Resentment depends on expectation. I no longer expect my family to operate outside their logic. In relinquishing that expectation, I reclaimed my attention. If this story has an ending, it is not one of closure, but of recognition. Recognition that some betrayals are not acts, but alignments. Recognition that autonomy is rarely granted. It is assumed once you stop requesting placement. Recognition that distance, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of respect. I did not leave my family behind. I stepped forward without them. And in doing so, I learned that the truest form of independence is not separation, but self-containment. The ability to remain whole regardless of the systems that surround you. They treated me like a liability because I disrupted their need for control. I became someone who did not need to be controlled, and that, quietly, changed everything. By now, the pattern has become so familiar that I no longer experience it as history unfolding. It feels more like terrain, something I move across with awareness, not anticipation. I know where the edges are. I know which paths lead inward and which ones carry me elsewhere. That knowledge does not restrict me, it steadies me. I have learned that independence is not sustained by distance alone. Distance can be accidental. Independence requires intention. It requires repeated, sometimes unremarkable choices to remain aligned when it would be easier to drift back into accommodation. There are moments when accommodation still presents itself as efficiency, as kindness, as simplicity. I recognize the appeal. I simply no longer confuse it with truth. My family continues to refine their structures. New contingencies are built atop old ones. Authority passes smoothly from one set of hands to the next. From the outside, it appears seamless. From the inside, I imagine it requires constant attention. That attentiveness is their inheritance, just as discernment has become mine. We coexist without strain because expectations are no longer misaligned. They do not look to me for reinforcement, and I do not look to them for permission. This mutual release has done more to preserve the relationship than any attempt at reconciliation ever could have. There is space now, space that was impossible when everything had to be accounted for. I sometimes wonder what my life would look like had I never noticed the early signs. Had I accepted the reassignment without curiosity? Had I mistaken being spared for being cared for? The answer no longer matters, but the question reminds me how easily people live inside arrangements they did not choose simply because those arrangements were introduced gently. That gentleness is what makes systems like my family's so effective. Nothing is forced. Everything is framed as reasonable. It is only over time that the cumulative effect becomes visible. By then, many people have already adjusted themselves beyond recognition. I did not want that to be my story, so I paid attention. I tolerated the discomfort of noticing. I allowed understanding to arrive before certainty. That sequence matters. Certainty reached too quickly becomes defensiveness. Understanding, when allowed to mature, becomes orientation. What I have now is not an answer, but a stance. A way of meeting situations without surrendering authorship. A way of remaining present without becoming absorbable. This stance does not require vigilance. It requires only that I remain honest with myself. Honesty, I have learned, is not loud. It does not argue. It does not insist. It simply refuses to cooperate with what is misaligned. Over time, that refusal reshapes everything around it. My family did not teach me this deliberately. They taught me by example through the precision of their control and the limits of their tolerance. In stepping beyond those limits, I did not reject what they offered. I refined what I carried forward. This selectivity was not defensive. It was preservative. It protected something that had taken years to recover, a sense of internal pacing. I no longer rushed to respond. I allowed silence to do its work. I trusted that what was meant to endure would not require urgency. When I am asked now whether I miss the sense of belonging that came with being embedded in a powerful family, I pause before answering. Belonging is not a singular experience. What I miss, occasionally, is familiarity, the shorthand of shared reference, the ease of assumed context. What I do not miss is the cost at which that ease was maintained. My life now contains a different kind of belonging, one that is earned through presence rather than position, one that adapts rather than consolidates. It is quieter, less visible, and far less impressive. It is also more responsive to who I actually am. There is no resentment left in me for what was withheld. Resentment depends on expectation. I no longer expect my family to operate outside their logic. In relinquishing that expectation, I reclaimed my attention. If this story has an ending, it is not one of closure, but of recognition. Recognition that some betrayals are not acts, but alignments. Recognition that autonomy is rarely granted. It is assumed once you stop requesting placement. Recognition that distance, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of respect. I did not leave my family behind. I stepped forward without them. And in doing so, I learned that the truest form of independence is not separation, but self-containment. The ability to remain whole regardless of the systems that surround you. They treated me like a liability because I disrupted their need for control. I became someone who did not need to be controlled, and that, quietly, changed everything. By now, the pattern has become so familiar that I no longer experience it as history unfolding. It feels more like terrain, something I move across with awareness, not anticipation. I know where the edges are. I know which paths lead inward and which ones carry me elsewhere. That knowledge does not restrict me, it steadies me. I have learned that independence is not sustained by distance alone. Distance can be accidental. Independence requires intention. It requires repeated, sometimes unremarkable choices to remain aligned when it would be easier to drift back into accommodation. There are moments when accommodation still presents itself as efficiency, as kindness, as simplicity. I recognize the appeal. I simply no longer confuse it with truth. My family continues to refine their structures. New contingencies are built atop old ones. Authority passes smoothly from one set of hands to the next. From the outside, it appears seamless. From the inside, I imagine it requires constant attention. That attentiveness is their inheritance, just as discernment has become mine. We coexist without strain because expectations are no longer misaligned. They do not look to me for reinforcement, and I do not look to them for permission. This mutual release has done more to preserve the relationship than any attempt at reconciliation ever could have. There is space now, space that was impossible when everything had to be accounted for. I sometimes wonder what my life would look like had I never noticed the early signs. Had I accepted the reassignment without curiosity? Had I mistaken being spared for being cared for? The answer no longer matters, but the question reminds me how easily people live inside arrangements they did not choose simply because those arrangements were introduced gently. That gentleness is what makes systems like my family's so effective. Nothing is forced. Everything is framed as reasonable. It is only over time that the cumulative effect becomes visible. By then, many people have already adjusted themselves beyond recognition. I did not want that to be my story, so I paid attention. I tolerated the discomfort of noticing. I allowed understanding to arrive before certainty. That sequence matters. Certainty reached too quickly becomes defensiveness. Understanding, when allowed to mature, becomes orientation. What I have now is not an answer, but a stance. A way of meeting situations without surrendering authorship. A way of remaining present without becoming absorbable. This stance does not require vigilance. It requires only that I remain honest with myself. Honesty, I have learned, is not loud. It does not argue. It does not insist. It simply refuses to cooperate with what is misaligned. Over time, that refusal reshapes everything around it. My family did not teach me this deliberately. They taught me by example through the precision of their control and the limits of their tolerance. In stepping beyond those limits, I did not reject what they offered. I refined what I carried forward. If there is any quiet satisfaction in this, it is not the satisfaction of having escaped something. It is the satisfaction of having stayed intact, of having recognized when belonging required too much translation, of having chosen coherence over proximity. I remain connected to my family by history, by memory, by shared understanding of where we come from. I am not connected to them by governance. That distinction is the foundation of the life I now inhabit. They built something that endures because it minimizes unpredictability. I chose to live where unpredictability could be met rather than managed. And in that choice, repeated quietly over time, I found a steadiness that no system could have provided, because it did not come from control, but from congruence. At this point, I no longer think of what I did as leaving. Leaving implies departure from something essential. What happened instead was a gradual refusal to be organized around priorities that were not my own. That refusal did not announce itself. It simply persisted. There is a subtle strength in persistence without justification. It reshapes relationships not through confrontation, but through inevitability. When you remain consistent long enough, others stop waiting for you to revert. They recalibrate their expectations, and in doing so, they reveal what they were holding in place all along. My family recalibrated in exactly this way. They stopped interpreting my choices as provisional. They stopped assuming I would eventually return to a more predictable alignment. Once that assumption dissolved, so did the quiet pressure beneath it. The relationship became lighter, not deeper perhaps, but cleaner. I understand now that what unsettles systems most is not opposition, but independence that does not seek approval. Opposition creates engagement. Independence withdraws it. Engagement can be managed. Withdrawal cannot. This understanding has followed me into every domain of my life. I no longer invest energy in trying to be understood by structures that depend on misunderstanding to function. I offer clarity where it can be received and reserve silence where it cannot. Silence, when chosen, is not avoidance. It is precision. I have also learned to recognize when my presence is being used to legitimize a process rather than to inform it. In the past, I would have stayed out of courtesy, out of habit, out of a desire not to disrupt. Now I leave, not dramatically, simply without explanation. Absence, I have found, communicates boundaries more effectively than argument ever could. My family, for all their sophistication, never developed that particular language. Their boundaries are enforced through inclusion and exclusion, through access and denial. Mine are enforced through attention. Where my attention rests, my authority follows. This does not make me invulnerable. It makes me deliberate. I still feel uncertainty. I still misjudge situations. The difference is that these experiences belong to me alone. They are not absorbed into a narrative larger than my life. They are allowed to remain what they are, events, not indicators. When I reflect on the person I was before all of this began, I do not see someone naive. I see someone attuned to harmony, trained to value coherence over clarity. That training served a purpose. It allowed me to survive within a system that rewarded adaptation. But survival is not the same as alignment, and eventually the distinction became impossible to ignore. What I have now is not certainty about the future, but confidence in my relationship to it. I no longer need to anticipate how my choices will be received in order to make them. I no longer measure success by proximity to power or endorsement. Those measures belong to a context I no longer inhabit. My family will continue to do what they do best. They will manage complexity by narrowing it. They will preserve continuity by controlling variables. They will remain admired for their discipline and foresight. None of this threatens me. It simply exists alongside my own choices. I have learned that it is possible to respect a system without submitting to it, to acknowledge its effectiveness without internalizing its demands, to remain connected without being contained. They treated me like a liability because I refused to simplify myself for the sake of their projections. I chose to remain complex, even when complexity made me inconvenient. And in choosing that, quietly, repeatedly, without ceremony, I built a life that does not require explanation to remain whole. That, finally, is what I carry forward. Not distance, not defiance, but authorship. What authorship has given me more than anything else is patience. Not the patience of waiting to be included or understood, but the patience to let things unfold without interference. I no longer rush to interpret silence, nor do I feel compelled to fill it. Silence, when it arrives now, is simply space in which clarity tends to surface on its own. I have noticed how uncomfortable this makes some people. Silence without explanation is unsettling to those accustomed to control. It offers no handle, no cue, no signal of how to proceed. My family was particularly sensitive to this. They preferred dialogue that moved things forward, that resolved ambiguity quickly. Silence disrupted that momentum. It resisted optimization. I did not use silence as a tool. I allowed it as a condition. This allowance changed how I experienced choice. I no longer felt the need to justify why I chose one path over another. The justification, when required, existed privately. It did not need to be persuasive. It needed only to be true. That shift alone reduced a great deal of friction I had once mistaken for responsibility. Responsibility, I now understand, had been conflated with availability. To be responsible was to be reachable, responsive, ready to be accounted for. By stepping outside that expectation, I did not become irresponsible. I became selective. I chose where my responsiveness mattered and where it did not. My family still operates under the older definition. They equate responsibility with presence, with oversight, with an unbroken chain of consultation. That approach has preserved what they value. It has also limited the range of what they can imagine. Imagination, after all, requires room. Their system leaves little of it unused. I have room now. In that room, I have learned to sit with uncertainty without translating it into anxiety. I have learned that not every decision benefits from speed, that some clarity arrives only after you stop pressing for it. This runs counter to everything I was taught, and yet it feels unmistakably right. When I reflect on the idea of betrayal one last time, it no longer points to an act or a person. It points to a moment of misrecognition, the moment when a system stops seeing someone as a subject and starts seeing them as an obstacle to be managed. That shift is subtle. It is often invisible to those inside the system. It was not invisible to me. Recognizing it did not require outrage. It required honesty. Honesty allowed me to step back without collapse, to let go without severing, to remain connected without being governed. These distinctions are delicate, but they are real. They are the difference between separation and sovereignty. My family may never articulate what happened between us in the same terms I would use. They do not need to. Our shared reality no longer depends on shared interpretation. That is one of the quiet privileges of independence. I am no longer waiting for alignment from others. I create it where I stand. I do not require consensus to proceed. I require only that I remain faithful to what I know to be true. That faith is not loud. It does not seek recognition. It does not demand permanence. It operates day by day, decision by decision, without spectacle. They treated me like a liability because I would not compress myself into something easier to manage. I allowed myself to remain whole, even when wholeness complicated their designs. And in doing so, I discovered that the most enduring form of belonging is not granted by systems or families or structures of power. It is granted by yourself. the moment you stop asking to be arranged. Once I stopped asking to be arranged, something subtle shifted in how I related to time itself. Time was no longer something to be optimized or defended against. It became a medium rather than a threat. I allowed days to be uneven, seasons to be transitional, decisions to remain provisional until they clarified themselves. This was not indecision. It was trust. Trust in my ability to respond when response was actually required. My family's relationship to time had always been different. Time was a resource to be allocated, a pressure to be managed, a horizon to be secured in advance. Every long-term plan carried with it an implicit anxiety about loss of influence, loss of position, loss of control. That anxiety was rarely acknowledged because it was shared. It passed as prudence. Outside that frame, I experienced time as something more forgiving. I did not need to defend my future against imagined threats. I did not need to protect my past by preserving its narrative. I could allow change to occur without interpreting it as instability. This altered how I held ambition. Ambition no longer meant expansion, it meant accuracy. Accuracy required listening, to myself, to circumstance, to what was emerging rather than what had been projected. It required a willingness to let certain possibilities expire without grief. My family rarely let possibilities expire. They archived them, preserved them, kept them alive as contingencies. I learned instead to let go cleanly. There were moments when this difference was unmistakable. A conversation where someone spoke about a future scenario as if it were already binding. A plan described with such certainty that it left no room for revision. I listened and recognized the comfort that certainty provided them. I also recognized its cost. Certainty, when premature, closes doors before you know what they lead to. I chose to live with fewer doors closed. This choice did not isolate me. It refined my connections. People who needed predictability drifted away without conflict. People who valued responsiveness stayed. My circle became smaller, quieter, less impressive. It also became more real. There was less explanation, more presence, less anticipation, more engagement. I noticed how rarely I now spoke about my family unless asked, not because I was avoiding the subject, but because it no longer organized my identity. They were part of my history, not my orientation. This distinction felt important. History informs, orientation directs. When I did speak of them, I spoke plainly, without indictment, without nostalgia. I described them as they were, capable, disciplined, effective. I did not add qualifiers. I did not soften edges. I trusted the listener to hear what was present without being guided to a conclusion. This trust extended inward as well. I stopped narrating my own experience in ways that made it easier to digest. I did not seek to make my choices admirable or resilient or inspiring. I allowed them to be sufficient. Sufficiency, I found, was a relief after years of performative coherence. If there is a through line in all of this, it is not independence for its own sake. It is congruence, the alignment between what I sensed and what I did, between what I valued and what I allowed. That alignment reduced friction more effectively than any compromise ever had. My family continues to believe that order must be maintained from the outside. I have learned that order can also arise from within. These are not competing truths. They are different answers to the same question. How do you remain intact over time? They answered by controlling variables. I answered by refusing to reduce myself to one. And in that refusal, quiet, consistent, and without drama, I found a way to live that no longer asked me to choose between belonging and being myself. There is a moment that arrives quietly, often unnoticed, when you realize you are no longer bracing yourself. You stop preparing for correction. You stop anticipating how a choice might be received. That moment does not announce itself as freedom. It feels more like the absence of weight. I recognized it one morning while making a decision that once would have required rehearsal. There was no internal debate, no imagined audience, no need to justify the direction I was taking. I chose, and the choice settled naturally into place. Only later did I understand what had changed. I was no longer orienting myself toward anyone else's framework. This altered how I experienced accountability. Accountability inside my family had always been externalized. You were accountable to the structure, to the future it was protecting, to the people whose expectations had already been set. Outside that logic, accountability became simpler and more demanding at the same time. I was accountable to outcomes, not optics, to consequence, not consensus. This shift sharpened my discernment. I became more aware of when something felt misaligned, even if it appeared successful. I stopped measuring progress by accumulation or visibility. I paid attention instead to how sustainable a decision felt over time, whether it required me to maintain a version of myself that could not rest. Rest, I learned, was not the absence of effort. It was the absence of contradiction. My family rarely rested in this way. Their world required constant vigilance, even when it appeared serene. The calm they valued was manufactured through control. The calm I now experience emerges from coherence. One must be maintained, the other simply continues. I no longer attempt to translate this difference when we speak. There is no shared language for it, and none is needed. We speak about concrete things: health, logistics, shared memories. The abstract has been quietly retired, not because it is forbidden, but because it no longer serves. Occasionally, I sense a faint uncertainty beneath their composure, a subtle question that is never voiced. It is not directed at me. It is directed at the world as it changes beyond the reach of their systems. I recognize it because I once carried it myself. The fear that letting go of control will invite collapse. I have learned otherwise. Letting go does not mean abandoning structure. It means releasing the illusion that structure alone can guarantee safety. Safety, I have found, comes from responsiveness, from being able to meet what arises without having to protect a predetermined outcome. This understanding has changed how I relate to endings as well. I no longer seek closure. Closure implies finality, and my life does not feel final. It feels ongoing, adaptable, open to revision without losing its shape. What I needed was not an ending to my family's influence, but an end to my dependence on it. That end came without ceremony. It arrived the day I realized that my life no longer felt like a negotiation. They continue to live within a system that rewards containment and foresight. I continue to live within myself, attentive and uncontained. These two ways of being touch occasionally, without friction or demand. And in that space between them, quiet, undefined, and honest, I have found a steadiness that does not require explanation. Not to them, not to anyone, not even to myself. I became aware of the ending before it arrived, not as a conclusion, but as a thinning of need. There was less to say, less to resolve, fewer edges demanding attention. What remained felt sufficient, as if the story had already done its work and was now simply resting. I no longer framed my life as having emerged from something difficult. Difficulty implies struggle, resistance, effort against force. What I experienced was quieter than that. It was a gradual clarification, a narrowing of what mattered until it could be held without strain. Once held, it no longer required explanation. My family occupies a stable place in this clarity. They are not antagonists in my memory, nor are they architects of my freedom. They are simply themselves, consistent, capable, bounded by the logic they trust. I no longer expect them to meet me where I stand. I also no longer need to distance myself to remain intact. We speak easily now, not often, but without tension. The conversations do not carry weight beyond their moment. They do not imply obligation or invite interpretation. This lightness is not indifference. It is balance. What I have learned is that peace does not arrive when everything is understood. It arrives when understanding is no longer required to proceed. When you stop asking why something unfolded as it did and begin to notice how little that question matters to who you have become. I do not regret the years it took to reach this point. They were not wasted. They taught me discernment, patience, and a respect for systems that function even when they are not humane. They also taught me when to step aside. The story I once believed I was living, a story about betrayal, exclusion, loss of position, has resolved itself into something simpler. It is a story about orientation, about choosing where to stand when standing somewhere familiar no longer feels accurate. I did not win anything. I did not reclaim what was taken. I did not expose or confront or demand acknowledgement. I adjusted my position until the strain disappeared. That adjustment, repeated quietly, became a life. They treated me like a liability because they could not integrate what I would not simplify. I allowed myself to remain whole anyway, and once wholeness no longer required defense, the story naturally began to end. There was nothing left for me to resolve. That realization did not arrive with relief or triumph. It arrived with neutrality, the kind that tells you a process has completed itself without needing acknowledgement. I did not reach an answer. I reached a position. My family remains exactly as they were, capable, disciplined, respected. Their systems still function. Their plans still extend forward with confidence. Nothing I did disrupted that. Nothing needed to. My life was never meant to serve as a correction to theirs. What changed was internal and irreversible. I no longer locate myself in relation to their approval or their concern. I do not measure distance. I do not interpret silence. I do not wait for alignment. These habits once shaped my days so completely that I mistook them for responsibility. Letting them go did not make me careless. It made me precise. Precision is quieter than control. It does not anticipate every outcome. It responds cleanly to what is actually present. It allows things to end without explanation and to continue without justification. That is the posture I inhabit now. When I am with my family, I am present. When I am apart, I am not missing anything. There is no tension between those states because neither one defines me. I no longer carry the expectation that belonging must be proven through participation or that love must be accompanied by access. I understand now that systems built on predictability cannot accommodate people who insist on remaining exact, not because exactness is dangerous, but because it resists being repurposed. I was never a problem to be solved. I was simply not optimizable. Once I stopped treating that as a flaw, the story released me. I live now without the sense of being arranged. My choices do not echo in rooms I will never enter. My future is not being buffered or prepared on my behalf. It is allowed to unfold, and I'm allowed to meet it without rehearsal. That is enough. They treated me like a liability because I would not compress myself into something manageable. I treated myself like an author, and then I stopped narrating. There is nothing more to add.